I destroyed my own boss's career over a PowerPoint presentation, and some days I still wonder if I should have just kept my mouth shut. My name is Ethan Miller. I'm 28, and until recently, I was a marketing analyst at a mid-sized tech company just outside of Chicago, the kind of place with exposed brick walls, cold brew on tap, and leadership posters about integrity hanging in every conference room. For the past 3 months, my entire life had revolved around one campaign, a nationwide digital rollout targeting small business owners across the U.S., with projected revenue in the high six figures if we hit our numbers. I was the one who researched the market data, built the strategy from scratch, mapped out the ad spend down to the last dollar, and stayed up past midnight more times than I can count adjusting performance metrics in spreadsheets that only I fully understood. My manager, Brian Thompson, liked to say we were a team, but in reality, I was the one doing the 60-hour weeks while he dropped into my cubicle every few days with a coffee in hand asking for quick updates that usually turned into hour-long interrogations about my logic. At first, I appreciated the attention. Brian had been at the company for over a decade, and everyone respected him. He had that polished, confident way of speaking that made even vague ideas sound strategic. When he told me, "This could be huge for your career, Ethan," I believed him. I thought the late nights and skipped weekends would pay off. I pictured myself finally being seen, maybe even considered for a senior role within the next year. As the campaign started showing strong early numbers, click-through rates above industry average, conversion costs lower than projected, I felt proud in a way I hadn't in a long time. Sophie, one of my coworkers, even joked that I should start practicing my acceptance speech for Employee of the Quarter. I laughed it off, but secretly, I let myself imagine what it would feel like to have my name attached to something successful. About 2 weeks before our quarterly town hall, Brian began asking for all my original files, not just the summaries, but the raw decks, the drafts, the detailed projections with my notes in the margins. He said he wanted to streamline the narrative for upper management. That made sense to me. He was the manager, after all. Presenting to the director level was technically his job. Still, I assumed I'd be in the room, maybe handling the technical questions while he framed the big picture. That seemed fair. The Friday before the town hall, I asked him casually if we should schedule time to rehearse together. He smiled and said, "Don't worry about it. I've got this covered." At the time, I took that as reassurance. Looking back, that was probably the first moment something felt slightly off, like a tiny crack in a windshield you only notice when the sunlight hits it just right. I ignored it because I wanted to trust him. I wanted to believe that hard work gets recognized, that managers advocate for their team, that the system rewards effort. I had no idea that in just a few days, I'd be sitting in a packed conference room watching my 3 months of work become someone else's vision, and that the decision I'd make afterward would change the way everyone at the company looked at me. The morning of the town hall, I got to the office earlier than usual, around 7:30, with a travel mug of coffee and a nervous kind of excitement sitting in my chest. The presentation deck I had built was no longer on my desktop because I had sent Brian every version he asked for, including the final polished slides with the performance projections mapped out quarter by quarter. I told myself that was normal. Managers present. Analyst support. That is how corporate structure works. By 9 o'clock, the main conference room was filling up, about 40 people from marketing, sales, and product, along with our director, Mark Reynolds, who rarely attended regular team meetings unless something significant was being announced. I took a seat halfway down the long table, close enough to see the screen clearly, but far enough that I would not be in the spotlight unless called on. Brian stood near the front, relaxed, sleeves rolled up, chatting casually with Mark as if this was just another routine update. When the meeting started, Mark introduced the agenda and then smiled at Brian and said, "Brian has been leading an exciting new growth strategy that is already exceeding expectations." I remember the exact phrase because my stomach dropped the moment I heard it. Leading, not overseeing, not supporting, leading. Brian stepped forward and clicked to the first slide. It was my slide. The exact headline I had written at 1:30 in the morning 3 weeks earlier stared back at me in bold font across the projector screen. He began explaining the market research, repeating almost word for word the positioning statement I had drafted in the original proposal. As he spoke, I waited for the moment when he would say my name, when he would acknowledge that I had built the framework and executed the campaign. That moment never came. Slide after slide. He walked everyone through the strategy, the budget allocation down to the dollar, the projected return on investment, even the contingency plans I had carefully outlined if conversion rates dipped below 3%. When Mark asked a technical question about cost per acquisition trends in the Midwest region, Brian answered using the same phrasing I had used during our prep meetings. I could feel heat rising in my face, not from embarrassment exactly, but from the strange sensation of watching someone else narrate my own thoughts as if they belonged to him. I glanced around the room, half expecting someone to look at me knowingly, but most people were focused on the numbers on the screen. Sophie, sitting across from me, caught my eye briefly. Her expression tightened, almost like she was bracing for impact on my behalf. The presentation lasted about 20 minutes. By the end, Mark leaned back in his chair and said, "This is the kind of initiative we need more of at the leadership level. Great work, Brian." There was light applause, the polite corporate kind where people tap their hands together while already thinking about their next meeting. I did not clap. I just sat there, hands folded, trying to process what had just happened. My name had not been mentioned once. Not as contributor, not as analyst, not even as part of the team that executed the plan. It was as if I had never existed in the process at all. When the meeting wrapped up, people gathered their laptops and filtered out into the hallway, congratulating Brian as they passed. I stayed seated for a few extra seconds, staring at the final slide still glowing on the screen, the one that summarized months of my work under the heading Strategic Vision for 2024. And I felt something shift inside me, something that was not just disappointment, but the slow realization that this had not been an oversight. It had been intentional. For the rest of that day, I moved through the office like everything was normal, answering emails, updating dashboards, sitting in a 1-hour check-in with the paid media team as if nothing had shifted, but inside my head the presentation kept replaying on a loop. Every time I remembered Mark saying "Great work, Brian," it felt like a small weight pressing against my chest. Around 2 in the afternoon, Brian walked past my desk and tapped lightly on the edge of my cubicle. He said, "Nice job on pulling the numbers together. They looked clean." The way he said it was casual, almost dismissive, like I had formatted a spreadsheet neatly rather than built the entire strategy from the ground up. I forced a smile and said thank you, because I did not trust my voice to say anything else without sounding emotional. A few minutes later, Sophie rolled her chair over and lowered her voice. She asked, "Are you okay?" I shrugged and said I was fine, but she did not look convinced. She told me it was strange that Brian did not mention me even once, especially since everyone on the team knew I had been leading the execution. Hearing someone else say it out loud made the situation feel more real. It was not just in my head. That night, I stayed late again, not because I needed to, but because I did not feel ready to go home and sit alone with my thoughts. Around 6:30, when most of the floor had cleared out, I opened the original project folder and started scrolling through the timestamps on the documents. Every draft had my name on it. Every data pull had my login credentials attached. The earliest outline, created 3 months ago on a Sunday afternoon, showed my initials in the file history. I remembered that day clearly because I had skipped a family barbecue to finish the framework. I told myself at the time that sacrificing one weekend would be worth it if the campaign succeeded. Staring at those files now, I started questioning whether I had been naive from the beginning. I replayed smaller moments from the past few weeks that I had brushed aside. The time Brian insisted on joining a call with the analytics vendor and ended up doing most of the talking, even though I had set the agenda. The time he asked me to send him a summary email he could forward to Mark, then later forwarded it without including my original message. The time he told me leadership likes to hear ideas from managers because it shows alignment at the top. None of those moments felt significant on their own, but together they formed a pattern that I could not ignore anymore. Around 7:15, I packed up my laptop and walked out to the parking lot. The air was cool, typical for early fall in Illinois, and I sat in my car for a few minutes before starting the engine. I asked myself a question I had never seriously considered before. If I let this go, what message am I sending about my own value? At the same time, another voice in my head warned me that challenging a manager with 10 years of tenure could backfire. I was 28. He was 42. He had relationships with senior leadership. I had a cubicle and a performance review coming up in 2 months. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, I was no closer to an answer. All I knew was that something fundamental had shifted. It was no longer just about recognition. It was about whether I was willing to accept being invisible in my own work. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, around 5:45, even though my alarm was set for 6:30, and the first thought that hit me was the image of that conference room screen with my work under someone else's name. I lay there staring at the ceiling of my apartment, running through different versions of a conversation I could have with Brian. In some versions I was calm and articulate, explaining clearly why it bothered me. In others I sounded defensive and emotional, which only made me hesitate more. By the time I got ready and drove the 25 minutes to the office, I had decided I at least needed to say something directly to him before making any bigger decision. Around 10 in the morning, after our usual team check-in, I asked Brian if he had a few minutes to talk privately. He looked slightly surprised but nodded and motioned toward one of the smaller glass meeting rooms. We sat across from each other at a narrow table, the kind meant for quick syncs, not serious conversations. I took a breath and told him I was confused about the town hall presentation and that I had expected to be included or at least acknowledged since I built the campaign. I kept my tone steady, careful not to accuse him outright. Brian leaned back in his chair and gave a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He said, "Ethan, this is how leadership works. As a manager, it is my responsibility to represent the team's output. When leadership sees strong results, they expect it to come from the top down." He added that my contribution was understood internally and that I should view the campaign's success as a shared win. I asked him directly why my name was not mentioned even once. He paused for a second and then said it would have complicated the narrative to spotlight individual contributors during a high-level strategy discussion. The word complicated stuck with me. It made my 3 months of work sound like an inconvenience. I told him I was concerned about growth opportunities and visibility, especially since performance reviews were coming up in a couple of months. He assured me that he would advocate for me when the time came and that I needed to trust the process. The conversation ended with him patting the table lightly and saying, "You are talented, Ethan. Do not sabotage yourself by overthinking." As I walked back to my desk, I felt more unsettled than before. Nothing he said directly addressed the core issue, which was that he had presented my ideas as his own. That afternoon, I noticed subtle shifts in behavior. Brian assigned me routine optimization tasks instead of involving me in strategic planning for the next quarter. He scheduled a leadership follow-up meeting about the campaign and did not include me on the invite. Sophie asked how the conversation went, and I told her it was fine, but she studied my face like she could tell that was not the full truth. The rest of the day passed slowly. I answered emails and adjusted ad bids, but my focus kept drifting back to the meeting room and the word trust. I realized that trust requires mutual respect, and I was not sure I felt respected anymore. By the time I shut down my computer that evening, a new thought had formed, one that felt heavier and more consequential than simply confronting my manager. If the internal conversation changed nothing, maybe the issue was bigger than just the two of us. Over the next few days, the atmosphere around me changed in ways that were subtle enough to be deniable, but obvious enough to feel intentional. Brian stopped dropping by my desk for casual check-ins, and when he did speak to me, it was strictly transactional. He forwarded tasks instead of discussing them. He copied more people on emails that previously would have been private between us. During a Monday strategy meeting for the upcoming quarter, he outlined an expansion plan that clearly built on the framework I had created, but he presented it as the natural evolution of his original vision. I sat there taking notes, realizing that if I stayed silent, this pattern would likely continue indefinitely. That afternoon, Sophie came by again and told me she had overheard 2 people from sales congratulating Brian in the hallway for turning around our marketing performance. She said one of them even mentioned how impressive it was that he had personally crafted such a detailed execution plan. Hearing that felt like confirmation that the narrative was already solidifying, and I was not part of it. That evening, I stayed late once more and opened a new folder on my desktop labeled documentation. I began organizing everything chronologically. The initial concept outline with my name and the file properties, the first draft of the budget spreadsheet created on a Sunday afternoon, the email threads where I proposed the targeting strategy, and the messages where Brian responded with short approvals like looks good or proceed. I downloaded performance reports showing the timeline of campaign optimization and saved them as PDFs. As I gathered the files, I was not entirely sure what I would do with them, but the act of organizing them gave me a strange sense of control. It felt like I was preserving evidence of my own effort before it could be rewritten. Around 8:15, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the company intranet page listing our core values: transparency, accountability, ownership. I wondered whether those words meant anything when applied upward instead of downward. I thought about my performance review scheduled in 2 months and how much influence Brian would have over it. If I escalated this issue, I risked being labeled difficult or not a team player. If I did nothing, I risked becoming invisible long-term. The next morning, I scheduled a 30-minute meeting with human resources through the internal system, selecting the option that said workplace concern. My finger hovered over the confirm button longer than I expected. Once I clicked it, there was no pretending I was undecided anymore. The meeting was set for Thursday afternoon with Laura Jenkins, our human resources representative. As soon as the calendar invite appeared, my heart started beating faster. I had never filed a formal concern before. I spent the next 2 days rehearsing how I would explain the situation without sounding emotional or vindictive. I focused on facts, timelines, documentation. By Thursday morning, I felt a mix of anxiety and clarity. I told myself I was not trying to punish anyone. I simply wanted acknowledgement and a fair representation of my work. Whether that belief would hold up once the process started, I did not know. But as I walked toward the Human Resources office that afternoon, I understood that I had crossed a line that could not easily be uncrossed. When I walked into the Human Resources office that Thursday afternoon, the hallway felt quieter than usual, like the building itself knew I was about to say something that could not be taken back. Laura Jenkins greeted me with a polite, neutral smile and motioned for me to sit down across from her desk. She asked how she could help, and for a brief second I considered minimizing everything, framing it as a small misunderstanding. Instead, I opened my laptop and began explaining the timeline of the campaign from the initial concept to the town hall presentation. I kept my voice steady and focused on specifics, showing her the original proposal documents with creation dates, the email threads where I outlined the strategy, and the performance reports tied directly to my login credentials. Laura listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes. When I finished walking her through the documentation, she asked whether I had addressed my concerns directly with Brian. I told her that I had and summarized our conversation, including his comment about leadership representation and trust. She nodded and said the company takes concerns about attribution and credit seriously because recognition ties directly to performance evaluations and career development. Hearing that made me feel momentarily validated, but she quickly added that these situations can sometimes be the result of miscommunication rather than intentional misrepresentation. She explained that her next step would be to review the materials and speak with Brian to understand his perspective. The phrase "understand his perspective" tightened something in my chest. I knew that once she spoke to him, he would know I had come forward. There was no version of this process that remained anonymous. Before I left, Laura asked what outcome I was hoping for. The question caught me off guard. I had spent days gathering documentation, but I had not clearly defined what resolution looked like. I told her I wanted formal acknowledgement of my role in the campaign and assurance that future presentations would accurately reflect contributions. She wrote that down and said she would follow up within a week. As I walked back to my desk, every step felt heavier. I could not concentrate for the rest of the afternoon. I kept glancing at Brian's office, half expecting him to call me in immediately, but nothing happened that day. The following morning, however, the shift was unmistakable. Brian's door was closed for most of the day, and around noon I saw Laura step out of his office with a composed expression. An hour later, Brian sent a team-wide email announcing a restructuring of responsibilities for the next phase of the campaign. My name was assigned to maintenance tasks and reporting, while strategic planning would be handled directly by him moving forward. The change was subtle enough to appear organizational, but I felt the message underneath it. Sophie sent me a chat message asking if I had seen the update. I replied yes, keeping it brief. By the end of that day, Brian had not spoken to me directly, but the distance between us felt deliberate and sharp. Driving home that evening, I questioned whether I had underestimated the consequences. I had wanted acknowledgement, but now I was facing isolation. At the same time, a small part of me believed that if I backed down now, I would confirm the idea that I could be sidelined without protest. I did not know how the investigation would unfold or whether it would amount to anything significant, but I understood that whatever happened next would define not just my reputation in that office, but how I saw myself in my own career. The week that followed felt longer than any quarter I had worked there. Every morning, I checked my email before even getting out of bed, half expecting a message from Laura with an update, but there was nothing. In the office, conversations seemed to quiet slightly when I approached, and whether that was real or just my imagination, I could not tell anymore. Brian remained professionally polite but distant. He delegated tasks through project management software instead of speaking to me directly, and during meetings he addressed the group as a whole without making eye contact with me. The new structure he announced meant I was now responsible for compiling weekly performance summaries while he handled strategic discussions with Mark. It felt like being moved from the driver's seat to the back row without explanation. Midweek, I received a calendar invite from Mark Reynolds for a one-on-one meeting scheduled for Friday afternoon. There was no description attached, just 30 minutes blocked off in a small executive conference room. My stomach tightened the moment I saw it. Mark rarely met with analysts individually unless something significant was happening. I spent the next 2 days replaying every possible scenario in my mind. Maybe Laura had escalated the issue to him. Maybe Brian had framed the situation as me being insubordinate. Maybe this was simply about campaign performance and had nothing to do with the complaint at all. By Friday, my focus was non-existent. At 2 o'clock, I walked to the executive wing, feeling the difference in atmosphere immediately. The carpet was thicker, the lighting softer, the offices larger. Mark greeted me with a measured expression and asked me to sit down. He began by acknowledging the campaign's strong results, citing specific metrics like a 22% increase in qualified leads and a cost per acquisition that came in 15% under forecast. Hearing those numbers directly from him felt validating, but I could not relax. Then he said he wanted to clarify roles and contributions to ensure alignment moving forward. He asked me to describe my involvement in developing the strategy. I chose my words carefully, outlining the research, targeting, framework, budget modeling, and optimization process without directly accusing Brian of anything. Mark listened closely and occasionally asked for clarification about timelines and ownership of certain deliverables. When I finished, he nodded slowly and said he appreciated transparency and initiative, especially from emerging talent. He also emphasized that effective leadership requires clear communication across all levels. The phrasing was neutral, almost diplomatic. He did not indicate whether he believed there had been wrongdoing, only that the company values collaboration and proper attribution. Before the meeting ended, he told me that human resources was reviewing the situation and that the goal was to strengthen team dynamics, not create division. As I left the room, I felt both relieved and unsettled. Relieved because I had spoken directly to someone with influence, unsettled because nothing had been resolved. That afternoon, Brian called an impromptu team meeting. He spoke about unity, trust, and maintaining a positive work environment during times of growth. He did not mention me by name, but the timing felt deliberate. I sat there listening, aware that whatever happened next would not just be about credit for a single campaign, but about the narrative forming around me within the company. I had wanted acknowledgement, and now I was at the center of a quiet tension that everyone could sense, but no one openly addressed. The following Tuesday, nearly 2 weeks after I first walked into human resources, I finally received an email from Laura asking me to stop by her office for an update. My hands felt cold as I read the message, even though the tone was neutral and professional. I closed my laptop, told Sophie I would be back in a few minutes, and made the now familiar walk down the hallway. When I sat down across from Laura, she folded her hands on the desk and began by thanking me for my patience. She explained that she had reviewed all the documentation I provided, spoken with Brian, and consulted with Mark regarding leadership expectations and attribution standards. She said the company concluded that while managers are responsible for presenting team initiatives, there should have been clearer acknowledgement of individual contributions, especially in cases where one employee led the development and execution of a project. Hearing that felt like a small release of pressure in my chest. She continued by saying that Brian had been advised to ensure more transparent credit allocation in future presentations, and that leadership would implement clearer guidelines about recognizing contributors during town halls and executive briefings. However, she also emphasized that there was no formal disciplinary action being taken, as the situation was categorized as a communication breakdown rather than intentional misconduct. The word breakdown sounded softer than the weight I had felt for weeks. Laura then shifted the focus toward moving forward. She said Mark believed I showed initiative and ownership, qualities valued in senior-level roles, and that my performance review would reflect my documented contributions to the campaign. She encouraged me to maintain professionalism and avoid allowing tension to disrupt team cohesion. When I left her office, I felt an unexpected mix of validation and anticlimax. There was no dramatic consequence, no public correction, no formal apology. Later that afternoon, Brian stopped by my desk for the first time in days. His expression was controlled, almost rehearsed. He said he understood there had been concerns about recognition and that moving forward, he would be more explicit about team contributions. He did not apologize directly, but he acknowledged that visibility matters. The conversation was brief and measured, like two professionals discussing a contract clause rather than something personal. Over the next week, subtle adjustments appeared. In a follow-up leadership email about campaign expansion, Brian included a line crediting me for leading the initial strategy and optimization. During a team meeting, he referenced my analysis by name when discussing performance metrics. The gestures were noticeable, almost deliberate, yet the atmosphere remained slightly strained. Some co-workers treated me the same as before, while others seemed cautious, as if unsure how closely to align themselves. Sophie told me quietly that people respected that I stood up for myself, but she also warned that corporate memories can be long. I found myself questioning whether I had strengthened my position or quietly complicated it. Although the official outcome framed the situation as a misunderstanding, I knew that without documentation and escalation, the narrative would likely have stayed unchanged. Now, at least on paper, my role was recognized. Still, I could not shake the awareness that challenging a manager alters the dynamic permanently. The campaign continued to perform well, and on the surface, everything looked stable again. Beneath that stability, however, I understood that trust, once tested, never returns in exactly the same shape.